We are joined by an Iowa coaching legend, as I will introduce him each and every week here on the show, Don Patterson. Who, Don, you will take a minute to kind of introduce you to some of our listeners who may be too young to remember yourself at Iowa, but you spent plenty of time under Hayden Fry. And of course, you can kind of give our background or our listeners a background too of your time with Hayden at North Texas. I know you and I have had conversations, but first of all, kind of introduce yourself to some of the listeners or watchers who don't know who you are. And first of all, we're just so excited to have you on the show with us.
I'd be happy to do that, Corey. First off, one of the things I'm proudest of, I was with Coach Fry 1 year at North Texas and then all 20 years at Iowa. And I'm proud to say I was the only assistant that was with Coach Fry his entire time in Iowa City. Something I'm proud of to have been so closely associated with him for 21 productive years. So it's a real honor for me to have that kind of history with Coach Fry. He's a great football coach, of course. There's no doubt he's a Hall of Fame coach, one of the best coaches that ever walked the sidelines. And I learned a lot from him. He gave me a chance to prove myself as an assistant coach, and then he prepared me well for the rigors of head coaching too.
And you have quite the pedigree as far as star-studded players that you've had the privilege of coaching over the years. We kind of talked about that before we went on the air live. Khalil Mack is one of the more recent names that maybe some of our younger listeners will be familiar with, but of course, Dallas Clark, Marv Cook. We talked about it, but who has maybe left the biggest mark on you as a coach?
Well, that's a tough question. Certainly, if I think back to the '80s, it's hard to not think of Marv first. You know, Marv was such a great player for us, not just an All-American, but a consensus All-American. That's very difficult to accomplish. I had the privilege of coaching him for his entire career. And of course, it speaks well for Marv that he also managed to make a couple of Pro Bowl appearances in his later years. So Marv comes to mind in the '80s. If I had to pick one player in the '90s, I would pick Tim Dwight. I coached quarterbacks and receivers then. And certainly Tim was the same kind of competitor at wide receiver that Marv was at tight end.
And Tim Dwight, of course, people here in the state of Iowa, Tim holds a special place in everyone's heart. What was he like to be able to coach him and such a legendary Hawkeye, but also brought that to the next level as well?
Yeah, very true. The first thing you have to realize with Tim, you had to be sure that you were always reining him in, because if it were up to him, he would just run himself right into the ground. You know, he's such a competitor, and he's like the Energizer bunny. You know, he never quit, and so we'd have to slow him up at times just so he didn't burn himself out. But an absolutely great football player, one of the most explosive athletes you'll ever find. That would be even true for his days in the NFL. You might recall, you're old enough, Corey, I think, to remember this. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he returned the opening kickoff in a Super Bowl when he was playing for the Falcons. I think the Falcons still lost badly, but at least Tim did his part.
I was too young to watch that live, Don, but I've watched it many a time on the YouTube. So I do want to get to college football in 2021 because it is back, and week 0 is fully underway. And in fact, the marquee game today was a game that I think Iowa fans were paying close attention to, given the fact that it was involving two teams from the Big Ten West. So we will get to Iowa and Indiana here in a little bit, but I want to start with that game, Illinois and Nebraska, because I know you, Don, take care of a lot of analytical work for Kirk Ferentz still to this day. And you were probably looking at this game between the Illini and the Huskers from a sort of different standpoint. Kind of maybe go over how you were looking at this game and sort of what you took away from it, I guess, from both teams.
Sure. Well, the first thing that comes to mind, especially in game 1 of any season, of course, there are certain players that maybe haven't even been on the field in a college game before that particular game. And the first thing you look for in early season games is that you don't beat yourself. And today, sadly, as you well know, a lot of people would argue that Nebraska did a good job of finding a way to lose the game. Simply made more mistakes than Illinois. Illinois had, and of course, Brett's an old and dear friend. I had the privilege of coaching Brett when he first came to Iowa as a walk-on tight end. But Illinois won today because they made fewer big mistakes. Really that simple. And both teams played with a lot of effort. I thought the Nebraska defense certainly did a lot of good things today. But if you want to talk about some specific mistakes, of course, and most of our listeners probably saw the game today since there weren't many options in terms of college football. But I used to coach punt returners years ago, and the rule back then was heels on the 10, meaning 10-yard line, heels on the 10, do not back up. It's as you would imagine, it's not easy to know where you are if your eyes are trained on a punt that's got 5-second hang time. It's not easy to know exactly where you are, but you should have a sense for whether or not you're backing up or whether or not you're moving forward. You know, you can at least have that kind of sensation. Obviously, today, the punt returner for Nebraska made the grave mistake of going back, and he actually fielded the ball on the 2. He had a little bit of momentum into the end zone, and in the end, of course, it turned up as the first 2 points of the game. Kind of unusual to see a 2-0 score. That usually involves a 2-run homer on the part of someone, but not today. It was 2-0 Illinois at the end of one quarter.
So, Coach, I saw some controversy on Twitter, and of course, watching that live as I did, I kind of was back and forth on it. Of course, as a Hawkeye fan, I would have probably felt differently had that happened to Iowa, but it seemed that his momentum was guiding him into the end zone as he was gaining control of the ball. So, as you understand the rule, would you have been upset? Would you have protested that call if you were Scott Frost?
No, I think it was the right call. You know, he clearly fielded the ball in the field of play. He was not in the end zone when he fielded it. Of course, that'd be a mistake to field it in the end zone either. But the bottom line, he possessed the ball out on the field. His momentum took him into the end zone, but he's the one that took the ball in the end zone. It wasn't the momentum of the kick; it was the momentum of the player.
Yeah. And of course, the errant throws from Martinez today. It seemed like the same issues that we've been seeing. And I go back, I don't blame Scott Frost for this. We've seen this as a sort of a reputation and a culture in that Nebraska program, at least in my opinion, even previously, even back into the Bo Pelini era, although Bo found a way to win more. But the almost egregious like mistakes. And you mentioned the punt play. What from your estimation, looking from the outside in and as a former coach, what is wrong with Nebraska? I know that's a general question, but does it start with the head coach? Does it start with the AD? Why does the culture seem to just kind of be on a train wreck right now?
Well, I know what Coach Fry would say, because he would remind us of this from time to time. If your players are making mistakes, then ultimately that's on you. You're the teacher. You're the person that's assigned the task of making sure they don't make mistakes. You know, your goal is that they never make an egregious mistake. And obviously, sometimes you get beat on a play. That's different. Maybe you know exactly what to do, and the other player you're going against simply overpowers you. That can happen. But to make silly mental errors, that's coaching. And ultimately, as you looked at those 2 teams today, you'd have to say that Illinois appeared to be better coached than Nebraska.
Is that concerning, given this is the first time out there for Brett? If you're if you're a Nebraska fan, I know it's concerning, but you have confidence in Brett. But how startling is that for Husker fans to think that here's a guy who's over 3 years in now, and yet Brett out coached him week 1?
Yeah, it's a concern. There's no doubt about it. You know, Martinez is a great athlete, and I always like the idea of having a quarterback, what I would call a combination quarterback, a guy that can run and throw. And Martinez fits that bill perfectly, you know, because he is one of the best runners in college football, and not to mention he's a capable thrower. But the mistakes are just far too many. I think I saw today that might have been his 36th turnover, I think, in his Nebraska career. They're not all his fault, of course. Sometimes a quarterback gets stripped in the pocket from a passing standpoint, and he couldn't see the backside rusher, you know, but the tackle simply got beat, and the ball got raked out, and the ball's on the ground, but it really wasn't his fault sometimes. But today, that was unfortunate, of course, that the ball came out. There's only maybe a minute left in the half, and the first thing you remind everybody, because you're still 50 yards from a score, at best you're going to have a long field goal attempt probably. But ball security matters greatly. And just to give you and the listeners an idea of how critical how critical turnovers are in the Big Ten. Last year in the Big Ten, we had 18 games out of those 50 that were played. 18 of those games were one score games. They were 7 points or less. Well, obviously, if you have that many close games, turnover margin matters more than it does normally. Even to put it in perspective, last year there were 40 teams that won on turnovers. Out of those 50 games, there was a defined winner in 40 of those 50 games. The record of those 40 teams was 35 wins and 5 losses,
No.
just because they had an edge on turnovers. So turnovers do matter. Now today that game was even on turnovers, but obviously one turnover was far more expensive than the other one, and that would be the strip sack, you could call it, the fumble on the part of Martinez that happened to be returned for a touchdown.
Sam Kim says that the interception was basically the game. The interception that was called back, I should say, by the roughing the passer penalty. Did you agree with that call, Don? I know you've coached quarterbacks. I'm sure you see it from both sides. Did you agree with the call, and how crucial was that call to the game momentum?
I do agree with the call, and I'll tell you why. It wasn't based on the contact of the helmet. It was not. It was not helmet to helmet.
Right.
The Nebraska player, I think he did lower his head. You could argue that he hit with the crown of his helmet, but the helmet was basically into the upper chest. But I think he got flagged because he planted the quarterback on the ground. He continued to drive him backwards, and he actually lifted his legs up. The goal of being frankly, to inflict as much pain on him as he could with that contact on the ground. You might recall, of course, that the starting quarterback for Illinois had already been knocked out, and maybe that was the same player. Was that before or after the starter was injured? I can't recall. Who threw that pick? I think it might have been the starter.
I was thinking that was Sitkowski, but I could be wrong. Maybe one of our avid Husker fans. I see some of the Husker anger that's sort of infiltrating its way into our stream, which is okay. We understand it.
Yeah.
I do want to get to a couple of these comments here, Don. Charles Pinster, and we saw this with Mark Rogers' live stream just before we went live. People are upset right now with Scott Frost, and I think finally, I don't know if Charles is a Nebraska fan or not, but I think a lot of people from the outside sort of saw Scott Frost going down this rabbit hole of not really taking accountability as a head coach. And I'm not really asking you to speak on that, Don. I know that's kind of a slippery slope, especially for a former head coach, but it just doesn't seem like he's a guy who calls himself out very much, but he's quick to call his players out, quick to call out. Of course, we know what happened last year against Iowa with the clapping claims against the Iowa coaching staff. Does he have much longer there in Lincoln?
Well, I would say the wins better start coming and sometime soon, because I think the honeymoon's definitely over. I did go back when there was a lot of discussion about Texas and OU leaving the Big 12. The comment I made to another particular radio show, I said, I think the OU and Texas fans should be careful of what they wish. And the example I gave was Nebraska. I actually went back and checked, and as I recall, I know for sure, Nebraska's been in the Big Ten for 10 years. They've had one appearance in the championship game. That was back in the days of leaders and legends. Remember that?
Sadly, I do.
That commissioner should have been fired on the spot for coming up with leaders and legends. But anyway, they did qualify that year, and wouldn't you know it, the team they played for the Big Ten championship happened to be a team that's now also in the Big Ten West. That would be Wisconsin, and that was Brett Bielema, a matter of fact, and Brett put 70 on them that day. I think it was something like 70-21. So I believe that was a Bo Pelini team. So they've been to the championship once. They got smoked in that one championship game they've been to. And as I recall, their record over 10 years, I'm talking about conference record, and that's really all that matters. You should schedule people you can beat in non-conference, of course, in general. But the conference record over those 10 years is 43-41. So it has not gone as Nebraska fans would have expected in the Big Ten. I think it's safe to say they would have a better winning percentage over the past decade if they'd stayed in the Big 12.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. As far as and we will get to, I promise we're going to get to Iowa, Indiana here in a little bit, but I know people, again, are still kind of salty about this game between Illinois and Nebraska. What did you see from Brett today as far as game plan, as far as a difference between, I know we talked about this before we went live, you know Lovie Smith personally, you know Brett personally, being able to coach him when he was at Iowa. What did you see as far as a schematic difference between Lovie last year and what the Illini are throwing out there, at least through week 0 this year?
I didn't see much of a change. Good coaching, of course, is adapting your game plan to fit the players that you have. It's kind of silly to try to put a square peg in a round hole or vice versa. So the thing I saw, I think the strength of Illinois in terms of returning starters maybe was O-line. They've had good success running the ball. Even last year, they were one of the better rushing teams in the conference, as I recall. They typically had done a good job forcing turnovers a year ago even. Maybe their only problem was they turned the ball over quite a bit on offense too. But I do recall that I thought Lovie's teams were one of the best in terms of generating turnovers on defense. If you go back and look at the stats, they've been among the leaders, I think, for sure, each of the last couple of years. So it does. Of course, you're familiar with the linebacker Hanson, who I think maybe
Yeah.
leads all of college football, I think, over the last 2 years. So they understand the value of turnover margin. And even though they only got one today, it certainly counted in a major way.
I want to read this comment from Jordan Bowman. This Illinois game was swing game to whether or not Nebraska makes a bowl. This was a game you had to have. How is Brett Bielema already in a better position than Frost, who's had 4 years? That's sort of the sentiments that I echoed. And I mean, you look at the schedule, Don. Again, I know that there's a lot of time left, but not a whole lot of winnable games. I don't think left on the schedule for this team. I mean, where do you see this team finishing? I know you're a coach. You probably don't like to look ahead, but is there any way they make it to 500 now?
Oh, I think there's certainly a chance of that. The reason I say that, they have good athleticism. Let's point out, too, that Oliver Martin, I think, surprised a few people, because I think there were probably some Iowa fans that didn't think he'd ever have a 100-yard receiving game, and today he did.
Yeah.
6 catches for 103, and the longest gainer, I believe, all day of 43 yards. So they have talent. There's no doubt about that. They're capable of winning against a lot of teams in conference, but the first thing they got to do is quit shooting themselves in the foot. That's been too much of a tendency over the last 3 years.
And of course, we know as Iowa fans, Nebraska has had the tendency to play Iowa close. But as you mentioned, Don, the penalties, the turnovers, not just last year, but really going back into the Mike Riley, Bo Pelini days, has really plagued Nebraska. So let's transition a little bit over to Iowa, Don. You've been just swamped, I know, with delving into last season's statistics across the entire Big Ten. This is a big game coming up for Iowa. We're not used to right out of the gate going into a Big Ten opponent, with the exception of last year due to COVID with Purdue, and especially a team that's a top 20 nature. And then, of course, following that up with a Cyhawk game, which is in Ames, and of course against a top 10 team. So what are your key analytics? What have you found from Indiana last year that can help Iowa this year that you can tell us? I know some of this is confidential, that will just be shared between you and Kirk, but what can you tell us about Indiana?
Well, I can certainly give you some statistical comparisons between the two teams, and it is safe to say we need to be in midseason form in game 1 and game 2, as you mentioned. Now, the good news, and Chad Leistekow pointed it out, and he's correct. If we're 0-2, does that prevent us from having a great season? The answer is no, because let's face it, if we lose to Indiana, that's not a loss within the Western Division.
Right.
You still got all 6 Western Division opponents out there. Obviously, if you go 6-0 versus the West, then you are in the championship game, unless, of course, you lost maybe 2 of those crossover games. If you lost 1, of course, at worst, you'd be tied with somebody else that you'd already beaten. So head-to-head, you would represent. So 1 loss in terms of 3 crossover games is acceptable, provided you sweep those teams in your side of the league. So in that regard, it's not a critical game, but who are we kidding? It's an important football game. It's a game that can give us some momentum into the Iowa State game. We need all the momentum we can get.
And of course, Iowa coming off the 6th game.
Let's talk about.
Sorry, go ahead, Don.
I was just going to say the all-important turnover margin battle. You'll find this interesting. Iowa's very good in winning on turnovers. Last year in 8 ball games, we generated 18 turnovers on defense, and we turned the ball over 9 times. So we got exactly twice as many. We gained twice as many possessions of the football than we lost, 18 versus 9. Here's the bad news. Indiana forced 20 turnovers and only gave up 10 themselves. So they were also a 2-to-1 ratio. The ratios are exactly the same. They were plus 10 in 7 games, as I recall. Yeah, plus 10 in 7 games. So when I ranked all the teams in terms of turnovers, they were plus 1.43 per game. That's number 1 in the conference. Ohio State, incidentally, is number 2, and Iowa's number 3. So both teams do a good job of generating turnovers. You'd expect that would be a push on game day next week. Maybe we'll be even on turnovers. I don't doubt that that'll happen, because both teams understand how to protect the ball on offense, and they understand how to generate turnovers on defense. Moving on to some other categories, red zone scoring success. It's going to be strength versus strength. Let me explain why. We've consistently been one of the best teams in the Big Ten in terms of red zone defense. But last year in games played, Indiana was actually number one on red zone scoring defense. Iowa was number two. I'm sorry, I take that back. Let me get my notes straight here. We were number five on red zone scoring defense. That's a little bit misleading. Here's what I was going to say about strength versus strength. We're number one on offense. Last year, we were the best team in the Big Ten on red zone scoring success. We averaged 4.87 points per opportunity, and you got to realize the max is 6 because I don't consider PATs as part of that number, part of that equation. So we made a good jump in terms of red zone efficiency on offense. The bad news is Indiana was number one on defense. So it's number one offense, our offense versus number one ranked defense in the red zone in Indiana. And then when you look at the other side of the ball, Indiana's number two on offense. We're number five on defense, but I would say that's a little bit misleading. Let me explain why. There are a couple of one-sided wins we had where the other team was in the red zone one time and converted with 6 points. Well, our average for that particular game would be 6.0, of course, and that actually drug us down a little bit in terms of final rankings. So that I would say that ranking of number five is actually worse than what we really are, because the score really didn't matter that much. We gave up a touchdown, but we still won 35-7 or 28-7, whatever the case might be. So red zone efficiency is very even on both sides on the part of both teams. Both defenses do a great job of keeping the opposing offense out of the red zone. In other words, you don't even allow the other team to get there. Indiana's second in the league. We're barely behind them, being third in the league. So we're very, very even there. We do a good job of keeping the other team, both of us do, keeping them out of the red zone. How about big plays? We're better than Indiana in preventing big plays. We were number one in the conference in terms of preventing big plays. Hats off to Phil Parker. Believe it or not, in 8 ball games, there were only 4 snaps that produced 30 yards or more on the part of the other team. 4, which was the best in the conference, hands down. We were also best in terms of explosive versus super explosive. Explosive plays I define as 20 yards or more. Super explosive, 30 yards or more. We were number one in both categories. Indiana was solid there too, though. Not nearly as good as us, but they're better than us at making big plays on offense. One place we very definitely can improve, we were ranked 13th amongst explosive and super explosive plays on offense. We need to do better than that. We can do better than that. Indiana was ranked considerably higher. They were number 8 versus our 13. And then there's another category I want to talk about because I refer to them as positive and negative exceptions. And let me explain what that is. Let's use turnover margin as an example. If you win on turnovers, we've obviously already stated in the game. If you do not win the game, if you win on turnovers and you lost the football game, you are what I would call a negative exception. In other words, you should have won the game based on the parameter, and yet you somehow found a way to lose for any number of other reasons. And today, Nebraska would be a good example of that. They actually won on total offense today. They had more yards than Illinois. Didn't matter. They still lost the game because they found ways to lose. They were, by definition, a negative exception today. So the team that's best in terms of being a positive exception and also best in terms of not being a negative exception, that team this year was Indiana. We were good, but not as good as them. In terms of positive exceptions, they were 1. We finished 4th. In terms of negative exceptions, they were number 1. We finished 8th. And that's a significant stat. Let me give you one specific example of one reason they finished number 1. You might remember the game, early season, Indiana versus Penn State. I know you remember the 2-point play at the end of the game. Yep. But here's the reality. Of those top 15 parameters that I identified as having the most to do with winning, believe it or not, Indiana won a total of 3 of those 15 parameters. Penn State won 12. How in God's name would Penn State win the game? Well, sometimes you got to find a way to win. And of course, in the end, that was defined by that successful 2-point play that was good by, I don't know, maybe a tenth of an inch. And I'm sure if you're a Penn State fan, you still
Can you hear me, Don? I think we lost Don here. We will see if we can get Don Patterson back. Always a joy to talk to Don. His level of expertise and analytics is second to none as it relates to Iowa and really any Big Ten school. The level of research that he has to do to come up with these numbers is incredible. And we'll take this moment as Don is hopefully able to get his internet issues figured out. I want to put in a plug for Iowa at the Voice of College Football. If you haven't heard already, of course, I'm sure you, if you're here today listening, you are a fan of Mark Rogers, the Voice of College Football, and the many, many, many team channels that Mark is now setting up, or actually has already set up, many established already, including Nebraska, Miami, Florida State, and of course, Iowa. And we have the privilege each and every week this year of having a post-game show here for Hawkeye fans. So it's going to be a great time. If you haven't already subscribed, be sure to subscribe here. Iowa at the Voice of College Football, Iowa at the Voice of CFB. And again, we'll be joined by Don Patterson just about every week. Don does some analytical work, TV analytical work for the University of Northern Iowa, an FCS team here in Iowa. And so he's unavailable, I believe, 1 or 2 weeks this year. But for the most part, Don is going to be with us each and every week. And let's see if we got Don back here.
Back.
Don, can you hear us? All right.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
No problem. No problem at all.
So I do want to bring up, Don, and I hate to cut you off here, but we did have a interesting question. And Roger Radloff, he says, good to see you, Coach. Where do you see Petrus' ceiling? Is he Nate Stanley 2.0, and will we finally use our talent at receiver? I know that's kind of a three-part question, but where do you see? Let's talk about Spencer Petrus here for a moment, because as we know, the quarterback battle, he's going up against a pretty impressive QB in Michael Penix. We expect him to be back healthy for week 1 next Saturday. Where do you see Petrus, his ceiling this season, and especially with 2 games right out of the gate that are going to be juggernauts?
Yeah. First off, a while back in time when camp started, I would have reminded Spencer, I would have actually told him in the spring, Spencer, don't fall into the trap of thinking you just need to be the best quarterback among those candidates at Iowa. What you need to be, you don't need to be better than number 2 or number 3. You just need to be the best possible version of Spencer Petrus, the best possible Spencer. That's who you need to be. And in that, I think there's still room for progress. The thing that comes to mind from the last year and the year before, when you have a receiver that's open deep downfield, the cardinal error, of course, is to overthrow that receiver. Today, Martinez had one down near the goal line in the red zone, had a guy wide open, and he simply overthrew him. And that shouldn't happen. It's actually okay for the ball to be a little bit underthrown, but the cardinal error, of course, is not to ever overthrow an open receiver deep downfield. The other thing that Spencer, I thought, from one season to this year needed to work on is to understand it's not all about velocity. It's all about touch. It's all about timing. It's all about anticipation on your throw. If you look at the very best NFL quarterbacks, the best example is Brady, I guess. He does not have a cannon for an arm, but he throws with great accuracy. He throws with great anticipation. His receiver selection is almost perfect. Of course, he throws with great accuracy, so that gives him a chance. The ball, when it arrives, is always catchable. It doesn't have to always be a fastball. It can be thrown at 90% of max velocity. And obviously, you want to make it as catchable as possible. And, of course, you want to make the throw as securely as possible. Sometimes you have to really gun the ball into a tight window. That's maybe because you're down to one last down and you have no choice but to throw it. But there are other times, of course, where you're wise to take something off the throw. Because let's face it, a throw that's not on target oftentimes becomes a tip pass, and a tip pass logically is maybe intercepted. So those are some things that Spencer can work on. Spencer's, he's a different quarterback than Martinez. Martinez is an example of a quarterback that you can actually count on him to have pretty good escapability, above average escapability. Spencer doesn't have that kind of footwork working for him. So the best thing he can do, of course, is be smart and be able to buy time by sliding left or right or forward or backward in the pocket. Be able to know where your dump receivers are, so you can get the ball out rather than throw it off the field. Um, Understand that it's okay to take a sack. Maybe if you stepped up in the pocket and it's an early down and you get tackled for -2, that's okay. That's better than running out of the back of the pocket and get tackled for -10. So understand that you need to be smart with how you play and you need to cut your losses. Those are all things he can work on still and become better. I don't doubt that he'll do that because he's a very conscientious young man. But we need him to play better than what he's played. And we need him to, without question, become a positive force for our offense. Last year, you could argue that he had some positive effect, but he had some negative effect too at times. And the goal going forward, of course, is to just be a more efficient player. And we need him to get that done because we have better supporting cast at some positions than a year ago, and in other cases, maybe not quite as good. So we need him to play better. He's one guy that should play better.
And the final part of Roger's question, will we finally use our talent at receiver? I would challenge that a little bit. I think Brian has been able to sort of tap into some of the, certainly with Kelton Copeland as at wide receiver, as coaching wide receivers, he has helped immensely, I think, with recruiting, with Amir Smith-Marset, Brandon Smith. But, they do lose their top two receivers heading into this year. Tyrone Tracy, Nico Reganey, Charlie Jones. Obviously, those first two are more than proven. Charlie more in the special teams category. One concern that I had brought up, and we're going to be releasing our season preview here from the Hawkeye of the Storm in Iowa with the Voice of College Football in the coming days. But one concern that I had, and I'd like to kind of pass this by you, Don, Iowa really doesn't have a whole lot of height at wide receiver this year. They lose Brandon Smith, who had huge hands, a guy who could, 6'2", could jump over anybody and make a catch, especially in the back of the end zone. Great fade route type receiver. How big of a concern is that to you? And I saw a graphic today during the broadcast with Nebraska and Illinois that Nebraska's average height at wide receiver, I believe, was 6'3", which seemed very, very tall to me. Now, of course, that's not really working out too well for them. But I haven't broken down the numbers. Maybe you know, but just glancing through the Iowa roster and the Iowa depth chart, I think Iowa's average is probably 6 foot or less. So is that a concern for you at this point, given the fact that
I'll tell you, Corey, it's not a huge concern. I'll tell you why. I can think back to some really, really outstanding receivers that were less than 6 feet. Let's just think back to Purdue's Rondale Moore. I believe he's pretty good, and he was certainly vertically challenged. But then let's not forget about guys like Tim Dwight. Let's not forget about guys like Damon Gibson and Demo Odoms, who played years ago but were very explosive receivers. And right now we have a guy, Tyrone Tracy's not that tall, but believe me, he's a dynamic player. And just get him the ball and give him a chance to run after the catch, and you're going to feel okay about it. Coach Fry used to say, I don't care. You never weigh or measure a man when he crosses the goal line. So a 5'10" receiver, he's good for 6 points on all of his touchdowns, just like that 6'3" guy. And I think, to be honest with you, I think it's a little bit overrated. Height is. Let's face it, the taller receivers typically are a little bit longer strider. So if you take a shorter receiver that's got great change of direction, he's more able to make people miss after the catch. And a prime example would be, let's just compare Smith-Marset to Brandon Smith. Smith-Marset was a better, Tyrone Tracy's a more dynamic receiver after the catch than Brandon. Brandon was taller. He made some catches up and over a defender. But let's face it, in terms of catching a ball underneath and making an outstanding run with possession of that ball, that wasn't really Brandon's game. And while I'm thinking of it, I've already mentioned it, we were one of the poorest teams in the conference last year making big plays. That's how far. I'm not putting all the blame on Blandon or Smith-Marset. Those are two guys, of course, that were in position to make plays for us. And sometimes it didn't happen because the ball wasn't exactly where it needed to be. But the bottom line is you don't measure a man when he crosses the goal line. So a 5'10" guy that can be productive, and there's lots of guys that have had good careers in the NFL that weren't that tall, especially inside receivers. Who was the guy for the Patriots, I think, that maybe recently retired? He's an undersized white guy, but he could play. And outside, I admit, as an outside receiver, It's nice if you can be over 6 feet because the good corners nowadays sometimes are 6 feet or taller. One of my favorite players that I recruited years ago that the Iowa fans remember was a guy named Merton Hanks. And Merton was that unusual corner because he had height. He had long limbs and he could defend against taller receivers and he was athletic enough to do it too. So it's rare when you find a guy that's 6'2" that's got really, really hot feet. And that's really what you're looking for. But those guys are hard to find. Devontae Smith, how tall is Devontae Smith? The guy from
I think
Alabama.
at least 6 foot,
I was
but
going to
not
say,
much more. Not
yeah, I
much
don't think
more.
he's much taller than that, but he's very dynamic. The guy's from Ohio State. Olave, how tall is Olave? He's not that tall either, I don't
No.
think. Maybe 6 foot, 6'1", but he's dynamic. He's very, very hot-footed. So, that's one reason those guys are such explosive receivers is because they're not quite as tall, which means they can put their foot in the ground a little bit quicker than the taller guy.
Joseph Walters, good thing we are tight end you. So you and I had a conversation about big number 84, who sports the same number as one of your favorite players in Iowa history, Marv Cook. Sam Laporta, how big of an impact can he have and how important is his health? I mean, really, this is one of the few years that I can remember, at least in recent memory, where Iowa doesn't have a standout tight end 2 or tight end 3 at this point. You hope Luke Lachey or Josiah Meeman or Elijah Yelverton can emerge there. Have heard good things about Luke, at least from Kirk in press conferences leading up to the season. But how important is Sam Laporta and his health?
I think Sam Laporta is critical to our success because it looks to me like he's equally capable in both run and passing game. He's a good, solid blocker. He's got good strength. He's a very competitive guy, but he's got soft hands too. And he understands how to be a physical player at that position, both run and pass. The question is, as you said, can we find another guy that we can trust almost as much as Sam? I've got a lot of faith in Lachey from a reception standpoint. Looks to me like he's got good signs. I haven't really had a chance to study him as a blocker. I suspect he's got some room for improvement there because he's a young player and he's still finding his way, so to speak. But we do need those guys to come through. And the thing that excites me, we have such a proud tradition at tight end. I'll promise you, when those guys walk in that tight end meeting room and see some of those former tight ends and their pictures on the wall, that gives them a little extra incentive to follow in those guys' footsteps and to be hopefully someday just as good as they were.
And I want to go back to the quarterback position just for a moment, Don, because I was reminded here in you speaking of one of the keys for me these first 2 weeks for fall camp, and that was developing Iowa's defensive line because it's going to be tested, I believe, by a couple quarterbacks who not only can throw the football down the field but are very mobile in Michael Penix and Brock Purdy. Um, Again, you've studied these guys at length. And of course, Iowa loses a lot on the defensive line from Davion Nixon, Chauncey Golston, and Austin Schulte, Jack Heflin. You can go down the list there. What do you see from the defensive line? That's been some people kind of concerned right now with the depth or lack thereof. I'm not there yet. I think that Kelvin Bell has proven himself, and of course, Phil Parker along with him. They've proven to be able to develop depth in the offseason. They got a spring this year to do so. What do you see from the defensive line, especially for 2 tests early?
I think that is a concern. Last year, we had the luxury of playing more than four down guys. This year, I don't know if our depth is going to end up as good as it was a year ago. And it's especially a concern in September. If it's as warm next Saturday as it was today, that's going to be a real concern. How can those guys that start for us in the D line, how many snaps can they play effectively? It'd be a lot to ask anybody to play a full game next weekend if it's as warm as today. So that's where your depth really comes into play, is those September games in warm weather. The last forecast I saw for next weekend included a chance of rain, but I think it was a more traditional temperature this time of the year, not quite as hot as it is this weekend.
People don't realize the black uniforms too, I'm sure, play a huge role in body temperature, just besides the fact that you're in pads and helmets. And I think, of course, injuries are a part of fall camp. Logan Jones, I've heard, has dealt with some injuries here this August, as has Noah Shannon. So does that elevate guys behind them as far as opportunity in fall camp to develop, or is that more of a concern given the fact that those are potentially two of Iowa's top 5 or 6 defensive linemen?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's really a balancing act. You want to prepare guys to play better football, and of course that involves some contact and practice to be able to get that done. And yet there's a point of diminishing return. You can't just go crazy in terms of contact and preparation for the season because injuries are gonna be tied into that. So it's a fine line. You want to get them ready, and you have to get ready by practicing a physical brand of football. And yet, if you spend too much time with it, then you're putting them at risk for injury even going into the season. And obviously, if you're going to be injured this time of the year, ideally it would happen on Saturday and not during the week.
Joseph Walters, T. Good, that's Tyler Goodson, is going to Sean Green the Big Ten this year.
I hope so. I do like Tyler. I think he's a good back. Incidentally, I saw a guy that played for us last year looking really good for the Tennessee Titans
Yeah,
today.
Mackay Sargent.
Yeah, Mackay did a nice job. He's going to make their team, I do believe. He's a
Wow.
good hard runner. He's hard to find, of course, because he's so short. So he's effective as an inside runner because the defense has a hard time locating him. I like Tyler Goodson. Tyler's a very competitive player and certainly athletic enough to make some big plays for us. Um, my only concern, this was during spring ball. We had a scrimmage, of course, for the fans to attend, and I was there watching too. And that particular day, this is again back during the spring. Can't remember if it was the first or second practice that was open to the public, but I do remember as the day played out, um, Tyler didn't have a lot of yardage because he simply didn't have a lot of room to run. And the concern I had, going in, of course, I was thinking the depth in our defensive line is not that good. But the way that particular day played out, I thought if I had to pick a winner, O line versus D line, I think I'd probably pick D line because we simply didn't have a lot of places to run. So now I'm concerned because I'm thinking the D line appeared to win the battle today, and yet the D line's not that experienced. So what does that say about our O line?
Let me
And of
play
course,
devil's advocate for you, Don. Is that a bit of a I see that as sort of a trendy thing at Iowa, at least the defense outperforming the offense. And of course, you know how to read between the lines there. But I've been concerned in the past because the defense just overwhelms the offense. Do you think it's part of that, or do you think that there is actually legitimate concerns? I don't know what you saw from Kids Day. I know you were referring to spring, but what did you see from Kids Day? Has that changed for the better?
well, Kids Day, it looked to me like the O line was in a little better shape, and of course, we were still missing one of our key starters in the O
Yeah,
line that day too. So it's a long season. We're going to start the season without Kyler Schott, and that's disappointing because he's one of our more solid offensive linemen. But with a little bit of luck, he'll be back. Maybe even in game 2, game 3. Don't know, but other teams will have injuries too. For all we know, Indiana's going to be missing one of their starting O linemen next weekend. We simply don't know. So the message, though, for those backups is that if you're second team, don't relax for a second because your mentality has to be that you're one play away from being in the game. And you better get yourself ready. And what a great example that we saw today. The backup quarterback for Illinois, he obviously was ready to play. He was 12 for
yeah.
15 for 2 touchdowns, and he didn't look like he was out of place at all. Of course, he'd started some games for Rutgers, but the bottom line is he didn't sit around and mope about being second team. I'm sure during camp he was taking full advantage of his reps too. And when the time came, he wasn't going to let his team down. He certainly performed well for him today.
Art Sitkowski and his numbers at Rutgers. I think he outdid all of his numbers at Rutgers today. And I think there's got to be some credit to Brett Bielema there. I want to throw this comment out here, and this is a Hawkeye homer. We appreciate Hawkeye Howard making this comment. I'm sure Don may have a a bit of a disagreement with this, but Iowa wins both games and goes undefeated. Your thoughts?
Well, if that guy'd like to bet me on that, I know I'd be happy to take his money. It's not realistic for any team to go undefeated. Maybe you'd say it's 50-50 odds that Alabama can do it, or maybe that Clemson can do it, but even Clemson's lost their quarterback, so maybe even those teams will struggle to do it. I know a lot about probability and statistics, and I would simply tell Hawkeye Howard, you do the math. Let's just assume for a second that Iowa is 80% assured of winning every game. And we got 12 regular season games, right? Okay, get on your smartphone and simply multiply 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8. Do that 12 times. The number left is a very, very small number. It's not realistic that anyone is going to win all their games. That's our goal, of course. And nothing wrong with an Iowa fan thinking that way. But right now, I just like to think we're 1-0 after next weekend. We better take these one at a time.
I know we're jumping all over the place, but I like this. Let me get to the right comment here. And I'm sorry, whatever YouTube user this is, I can't pronounce these letters together. But opinions on defensive back Williams, and he's referring to Xavier Williams, a guy who I'm sure you are familiar with, Don, given your pedigree with UNI. And here's a guy who there was some nice hype around him deciding to transfer in. We got the feeling from some comments from Kirk that he was a little behind, has not showed up on the depth chart that I'm aware of. What are your thoughts on Xavier and his impact this season? Will he be in a position to make an impact with a very deep, I think, defensive backfield?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a good chance. I don't know for week one. Maybe he's not on the two deep right now, but I think there's certainly a chance as the season plays out that he'll, at the very least, be in our two deep. I think he's a good, solid player. Obviously, Iowa wouldn't have accepted him as a transfer if they didn't think he could provide him with some quality depth as a bare minimum. He's an outstanding player. He's certainly, he's a competitor because he wouldn't have made the move if he wasn't excited about how he step against Big Ten receivers. So I don't doubt as the season plays out that we'll see more and more of Xavier. And I certainly know he played well for UNI. And as you know, Khalil Mack's a good example of a guy. Khalil Mack had one offer coming out of high school. People would be surprised to hear that. He's from North Florida, and the only school that thought he was good enough to play college football was Buffalo. He was actually known more as a basketball player in high school, if you can believe it, especially as a sophomore and junior. But what a great player. And if Khalil would be on here with us, he would be very, very quick to give credit to his coach. And a lot of those people that have some idea of Illinois football would appreciate what I'm about to say. Khalil would say that he owes so much to a coach by the name of Lou Tepper. Lou was the defensive coordinator at Illinois with those great Illinois defenses back in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. And I had a chance to coach with him for 3 years at Buffalo. And certainly, I don't think there's any way Khalil would have developed as well as he did without the mentoring of Lou Tepper as his position coach. Lou actually has written a book, and it's on just about every linebacker coach's shelf. It's simply a book about linebacking play. And he's written a book on it, and he's one of the very best. He's now retired, but an outstanding coach and a great man.
What did you see from Xavier at UNI, Don, specifically? I mean, did he really pop out at UNI? Was he a guy that you could see making an impact on special teams? I mean, again, I know you brought it out that Iowa wouldn't have offered him a scholarship had they not seen something in him. But I would think that he had to have jumped out on tape with you watching him at UNI.
Yes, he did. I just saw more athleticism than what you see out of most players, at least in FCS football. I thought in terms of athletic ability, he was more aligned with those you see in the Big Ten. He's certainly capable of competing with athletes that you find in the Big Ten. And again, it's all about how he compares to other outstanding players that have been recruited by Iowa through the years. You know, we've made a lot of good decisions in who we've recruited to play in the secondary, and the competition is stiff. But as I've already mentioned, to be second team or even third team is not necessarily an indictment. It may simply mean there are one or two players that are even better than you. And the key is to be ready when your opportunities come and take advantage of them. And I hope that Xavier's doing that even then.
You are listening to Iowa at the Voice of College Football. We are sitting down with Coach Don Patterson, who has an impressive coaching pedigree, including many, many years with Coach Hayden Fry. And I want to get to a comment from a YouTube user who is the real Hayden. That's what he's named himself here, the real Hayden. So this is a good question, though, and I haven't really thought about this, and at least looking at the depth chart myself. He asks about the size on the offensive line. No one over 300 pounds. This is the lightest line he can remember. He doesn't usually worry about line play at Iowa under Ferentz, but he's a little concerned. We talked about size at wide receiver. You kind of downplayed the impact of a taller wide receiver at Iowa, or anywhere for that matter. Your are you concerned at all about lack of size along that offensive line?
Talking about receivers again, I think of guys like Jerry Rice, who I don't know that Jerry Rice is 6'2" either. I think he might be 6'1", but I don't know that he's 6'2". There are taller receivers out there than Jerry Rice, that's for sure. O-line play, the old Iowa fans will remember a guy by the name of Bob Cratch. Bob Cratch was an offensive lineman for us years ago, and I realize players have gotten bigger since then, but Bob Cratch, I don't think probably played at more than 280, but he had some of the strongest legs of anybody you'll ever find, and Bob Cratch was good enough to start for the New York Giants, as I recall, back in the day. So I've seen some really good linemen in the Big Ten that were certainly less than 300 pounds. I've seen some guys over 300 pounds that frankly weren't very good players simply because they weren't quite able to move well enough. I do understand where the real Hayden's coming from. It does help to have size, but more important than size is strength. And I've seen some guys that are 290 that certainly are stronger than guys that are 320. So it needs to be productive weight. You can imagine next weekend trying to play even 50 snaps on a hot day if you weigh 325 pounds. That's a problem. The 300-pounder is going to have a little better chance to still have good energy late in the game because he's doing a little bit less work on any given snap than the guy that's carrying the extra weight.
And I think Iowa fans, I can kind of see where the real Hayden comes from here because we are used to Tristan. I mean, we've had Tristan Wirfs and Alaric Jackson here for it seems like an eternity.
Right.
And of course, two really big bodies. Are you comfortable at tackle right now? I know Jack Plum is a guy who is listed as the number one at left tackle right now. Mason Richmond is a guy that has stood out, at least in spring. Not sure if you have any thoughts on him or anybody else there. Nick DeYoung, another guy, I think, at right tackle, who
Right.
will probably end up starting week one.
I haven't had a chance to really study those guys very closely. I am concerned because, as you mentioned, we've lost two really good offensive tackles that had a lot of starts under their belt over the last few years. And the other problem you get into, I always feel if you're strong up the middle, and of course we have a great center, our guards in general have good experience and generally have more experience than our tackles. And the tackle, the difficulty with the tackle, if you're looking at, let's just think about a guy, a college equivalent of Khalil Mack again. You know, if you have any really accomplished pass rusher, doesn't matter if he's playing on Saturday or playing on Sunday. Khalil Mack, there are a lot of offensive tackles in the NFL that can't block him very well either. Matter of fact, you probably know this. The only sack that Tristan Wirfs gave up all season was to Khalil Mack. I don't know if you knew that, but that's
Oh,
the
yeah.
one. So that's okay. If Tristan only gave up one sack and it happened to be Khalil Mack, I'd say that's probably still an indication of really good offensive line blocking. I am concerned against those teams that do have great edge rushers, and I don't know who they are for sure in the Big Ten right now, but obviously Kirk is a really smart guy. If a tackle needs help, there are ways to help a tackle in passing situations. You know, you can line up a tight end next to him, and the tight end's still going to go out on a route, but maybe he's going to chip on that edge rusher a little bit and take away his first step a little bit so that tackle can have better success in blocking him after that tight end moves into his route. Another possibility, of course, is for a back to chip on that same player that's rushing up the field and just give that tackle a little bit of help. Just for a split second, maybe there's a guy helping him. That's a possibility to do things like that. The other possibility, of course, is simply to keep the tight end in altogether. And now you've got two guys blocking one, and obviously he shouldn't be any kind of factor on the play at that point in time. So you got to make those kind of decisions. Sometimes just having an aligned tight end, what I call an attached tight end, he's lined up next to the tackle. Well, now you put that edge rusher in a little bit of a bind. Where does he line up? Does he line up just on the outside shoulder of the tackle? I don't think so. He's going to line up wider probably. If it's a four-man front, he can't afford to be outflanked to that extent. So he's probably going to line up inside eye of a tight end. And now the tight end's in position to stymie him a little bit on his first step and make it easier for that tackle that's next to him.
Drew Freeborn asks, do you have a strategy against Indiana's defensive backs? I think it might be difficult to pass downfield. I would personally be more concerned with Spencer Petras. I'd be more concerned with his ability to get the ball downfield in the right spots first and foremost. But that's a valid concern against a talented secondary for Indiana.
I don't know that much about Indiana's DBs. I really haven't studied them. That's not really um, a position that I care to be in. I have great faith in our coaches and their ability to study those same players. I would say this though, uh, if you're gonna
We may have just lost Don again. Well, while we have a moment, we'll put in another plug for Iowa, the voice of college football. If you're enjoying what Don brings to the table, he is, again, the best in the business as far as analytics and breaking down Iowa football. And we are so thankful to have him. If you're enjoying this broadcast right now, please share this video, share our channel, whether it be on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you social media, so to speak, because I'll steal a quote from Mark Rogers himself. If you're enjoying the content, others will as well. And certainly Hawkeye fans love being primed and ready for any Iowa game, let alone two marquee games like Indiana and Iowa State. So next Saturday after the Indiana game, we will be here right here at Iowa, the voice of college football, discussing the game with Don, talking about hopefully an Iowa win. But of course, long ways to go, and it's just great to have college football back. So we will try to get Don back here in a moment. Want to also put a plug in for Mark's channel. Let me throw a banner up here for everybody. If you don't know this already, if you're new to Mark Rogers TV, if you're new to the voice of college football, a number of team channels have been launched. So even if you're not an Iowa fan, you're enjoying just the college football talk, check out Mark Rogers at the voice of college football because so many different channels, and your team quite likely is among those channels, and many, many post-game shows this season as well. If you want to donate to Mark Rogers, you can look at the description below, PayPal, Venmo, Cash App. Certainly, you can donate a super chat as well. That's all much appreciated. If you do so, please comment that it's for the Iowa channel and help support our channel. But again, the biggest way you can support us is by continuing to put the word out about our post-game shows, about the content that we're producing. And we're filtering out content basically every day in lead up to the season, and we'll be putting out regular content all season. And we are going to enjoy each and every week being able to discuss Iowa football with this man, Don Patterson. I think we have you back, Don. So
yes,
apologize for the glitch again there. So I believe we were talking about Indiana's DBs and Iowa quarterback Spencer Petras. Not sure where you left off there, Don, but you have the floor if you have anything else to add on that.
yeah, there was some concern on the part of the fan. Were we going to be able to throw the ball deep downfield? I don't know, but I do know this. Um, if you want to try to connect on some big plays down the field, then you got to take some shots down the field. I'll give you a prime example. Years and years ago, I still remember Coach Fry telling Bill Brazier, our defensive coordinator, this back in the days of Lee Corso in Indiana. We were getting ready to play Indiana, and he said, "Now, Bill, I know about Lee Corso. I will promise you he's going to air it out at least half a dozen times. We better be ready because he's going to test us deep." And that was the truth. And there was another guy back then that had that same reputation that just recently passed away, and that would be Bobby Bowden. Bobby Bowden in Florida State. They were gonna check you out deep at least half a dozen times. And Corso would do that. They had a guy years ago. Um, can't think of his name right now. I'll think of it later probably, but um, whatever the case, an Indiana receiver was a big receiver as I recall, and they would throw the ball deep to him, and they might only connect on 3 out of 8 attempts down the field, but all three of them are big plays. Dwayne Gunn was the name of the guy back in the 80s, I believe. And so here's my point. For us to connect on balls deep downfield, we got to throw some downfield. And it's not just a question of doing it and being haphazard about how you do it. It has to be really well thought out. We need to put our best guy against their weakest guy. And we need to know for sure who that weakest guy is. And obviously it might tie into pass protection too. Are we at this point in the game where we can buy that much time and allow our receiver to run deep downfield and give Spencer enough time to give that receiver a chance to get separation from the corner? So there's a lot that goes into that, but that's some of the thoughts. And I would like to think that we take some shots downfield. One of my concerns, as I mentioned, we were next to last in the conference in terms of explosive plays. I'm talking about plays that were 20 yards or more down the field. We were not very good. We were no better at super explosive plays, 30 yards or more. We had only 8 in 8 ball games, and that may sound like a lot, but that's one of the lowest totals in the conference. By comparison, I think Ohio State probably had 20 or more in those same number of games, or even less. I think they only played 6 games, didn't they? So one reason we haven't felt that to be such a problem, Corey, is simply because we give up even fewer big plays on defense. So that's why it doesn't seem so bad, because you don't remember the other team making many big plays on us either. That's true, but the truth of it is we should have a plus margin there. We should be making considerably more plays downfield than they are, because we simply don't give up many on the defense.
Best punter you've ever coached, and you can't say Reggie Roby.
That's easy. I had a guy named Mike Cyphers who was at Western Illinois. And I'll tell you a quick story about Mike. He punted 12 years, I believe it was, for the San Diego Chargers. He was a great punter. He was also the holder for Nate Kading on PATs and field goals. Okay. And Mike, incidentally, also could kick. He had a 54-yarder to beat Northern Iowa in the Dome and win us a conference championship one year. 56 yards, I think it was, the more I think about it. And the amazing thing was, he didn't even kick until that game. He didn't kick the previous week, but our starting kicker was out with the flu, and Mike went in, and after the game, they asked me, they said, what would make you think your punter could hit a 56-yard field goal? And I said, well, he was hitting them from 60 in pregame. So I know it sounds silly, but I didn't think for a second that he wasn't going to make it, because it's Mike Cyphers. Rest of the story on Mike Cyphers. Mike Cyphers led 1AA football in punting, and his senior year, I remember asking our sports information director, I said, do me a favor, go back and look at all of Mike's punts, except only record the average if he's on the other side of the 50. In other words, he's got a long field. And he came back later and he said, Coach, Mike's average was 52.0. And I said, that's what I thought. He really is a better punter than Roby. Reggie Roby to this day has the NCAA record. It's 49.8. But here's the dirty little secret. Reggie didn't pooch punt. Reggie always had a long field back in those days. And when I told the sports information guy this, he said, well, we can publicize Mike then as the best punter in the history of college football. And I said, no, we really can't do that, because we only punted 4 times a game. And one of those on average per game was a pooch punt. So Mike wouldn't have even had enough punts to qualify, except for the fact that he also pooch punted. Here's how good Mike Cyphers was as an NFL punter. One year in the playoffs, after the game, no less than Peyton Manning said, we lost to the Chargers today because of Mike Cyphers. Now, what a great compliment to an NFL punter. You don't hear too many Hall of Fame quarterbacks saying that they lost because of the other team's punter. That's how good Mike was.
And Joseph Walters, that kind of leads into this question from Joseph Walters. How about that punter, though? So he's referring to Torrey Taylor. How good is Torrey Taylor? I mean, stacking him up against Mike and against Reggie, I know it was small sample size, but here's a kid who's just brand new to the game of football. I think that's just a tremendous story, and his age is kind of an interesting tidbit as well. What are your thoughts on Torrey?
Well, he is mechanically advantaged, what I would say. He's got a long leg. Both Reggie Roby and Mike Cyphers had long limbs. It does help a little bit. Of course, I'm not a great fan of rugby punters. I know that's the new thing now is rugby punters. The only problem I have with it, what I wish, and I know that our punter's working on it to some degree. Last year, if I'm not mistaken, he punted 40 times, 39 of which were rugby punts. I think only once did he have a conventional punt. And I would simply, when I heard that he was practicing more on the traditional punt as well, be able to do both, I like that idea, because if you can spin the ball like Reggie Roby or Mike Cyphers and have a good, strong leg, as our punter does have, then you can be more than capable with the traditional punts. And now you can also rugby punt at times. And now you have that uncertainty about which kind of punt you're going to see. And of course, if you're rugby punting all the time, some people might try to engineer a punt rush to get to that spot in a rugby punt. And typically, if you're right-footed, of course, you're moving to the right as you punt the ball. And, of course, your block point, you're going to engineer your rush so that you try to get to that block point that's also offset to that same side. So if sometime you're going to step in the traditional sense straight ahead to punt the ball, and sometimes you're going to move to the right as a right-footed punter would in a rugby punt, I think it could give you a little advantage that you might show up with either type of punt.
And I don't know what your background, Don, is with Australian punters. And of course, I think seems like Australia is being more heavily recruited now than it was probably. Was it recruited at all, really, back in the
No,
80s and 90s?
no, not back
So,
in.
what do you know as far as players from Australia being able to develop into having a leg that can kick or traditional, I want to say American style punt as opposed to rugby punt? Is there good data to back that up?
To be honest with you, I'm not sure that any of them have really become very accomplished with the traditional punting style. Maybe long term, our punter can get that done. He certainly talked about it. He talked about being able to be proficient also as a traditional punter. And I thought that was a good idea because he'd probably be the only Australian punter that could do both. That might make him even more marketable to the NFL. I think it probably would. The other thing that comes to mind for me about rugby punts, I know as a head coach, we saw some rugby punts even when I was at Western Illinois. And a better example would be remember when Tim Dwight was a punt returner? People decided, it wasn't rugby punts, but they decided we're going to simply punt the ball away from Tim Dwight.
No.
I do recall, and I flash back now to the Peach Bowl, 1982, Coach Fry very logically said, Reggie, you're the best punter in college football, but I'm going to ask you every time to get the punt off the field. The reason is Tennessee had a guy named Willie Guy, not Willie Guy. What am I thinking? Willie Galt. Remember Willie
Okay.
Galt?
Okay.
Willie Guy played for us, of course. Willie Galt, and he was one of the fastest humans playing football. He was a very electric punt returner. And at the end of that Peach Bowl, one of the reasons we won the game is Willie Galt hadn't returned a punt yet because Reggie got the ball off the field every time. So, going forward, the thing that comes to mind for me that year when Tim was I think he led the Big Ten maybe in returns even as a freshman. And at some point in time, they decided to punt the ball away from Tim. Well, we took another good punt returner by the name of Tony Collins and put Tony back there. And now, with them being able to cover the field, you couldn't punt the ball away from both of them. And people then initially, they decided, I know what we'll do. We'll still punt the ball away from Tim Dwight because Collins is not as good a returner. The only problem with that, Tony was an accomplished punt returner too. And if you punted it to him, you only had a demon like Tim Dwight that was blocking for him. And Tim would
Yeah.
decapitate you as you came downfield. If you're looking up for the ball, Tim Dwight's helmet's going to be right under your chin. And Tim used to take great pride in being able to be an effective blocker. I believe that year Tony Collins' average might have been better than Tim's, simply because we countered the fact that people were going to try to punt the ball away from a single returner.
Right.
So the thing I don't like about rugby punts, let's face it, if they're fielded on the fly, sometimes they can come right back at you because there's no hang time involved in so many cases. And the best way to be able to get that accomplished, of course, is to put another returner back there. And now if they want to punt to the wide field, they risk our guy being able to field it on the fly. That gives you a chance, of course, to run through the coverage before the coverage really has a chance to collapse on the ball.
And that kind of goes into a question from Charles Spinster. I hope Charlie, or I guess a comment. I hope Charlie Jones can be like a Julian Edelman for us. I think he's referring more to his receiving ability. We saw what he could do in the punt game. Do you see punters starting to kick away from Charlie, given his success last year?
I do like Charlie Jones. Incidentally, Charlie Jones transferred from the University of Buffalo.
Yeah.
And what I like about him, he is fearless as a returner. Now, it's one thing to be fearless. It's another one, of course, to have good judgment. It doesn't mean he's going to return every ball. If it's got great hang time and the coverage is good, logically he'll fair catch that. You don't want to be foolish with what you're doing. But I do know this: Charlie knows what to do with the ball when he gets it. He had a touchdown a year ago as a punt returner, as I recall, and had some other significant returns. So he's fearless in the return game. He's got excellent hands. That's where it all starts, is just being able to consistently field the ball. Because let's face it, a muff punt is like a 40-yard bomb. The ball's
Yeah.
moved 40 yards down the field. It simply wasn't a pass, it was a punt. So it is critical that you have great ball security with your fielding, and Charlie has that. I like him as a receiver too because he's got good spurt. He's got good explosiveness. He's maybe top end speed is not great. It's pretty darn good, that's for sure. But he has quickness and speed. You might even argue that he's got better quickness than he does speed. But he certainly has a good speed element to his game, and he appears to have very good hands. How could you not have good hands? I think the toughest skill in football is fielding punts, and he's proven he's very good at that. So it's no surprise that he demonstrates the same kind of great hands as a receiver.
Charlie did get into some trouble late last year, I believe, against Illinois, not using wise judgment and did muff a punt. So we see where that can kind of come back to bite a guy who doesn't realize when it's time to rein it in. But I think that was probably a teaching moment for LeVar Woods and certainly Kirk and Charlie. So I expect big things out of Charlie Jones this year. If he can develop into a threat at wide receiver, that just helps the offense immensely, I believe, because he has the ability. We saw it last year at times, being able to run jet sweeps. You send him in motion. I would have to think that would pay dividends with just staying unpredictable, Don.
Yeah, I agree with you. The thing I like about Charlie, even though he's a younger player, he plays like a veteran player. He's not afraid to play the game. I'll say it that way. He doesn't look like he's in it all over his head. The moment is not too big for him. I think if the game's on the line and the ball's headed his direction, he's going to catch it every time. That's just, I believe, how good he is.
Bob Stoops to Iowa when Kirk is a real old man and retires. Do you buy?
Anything's possible, I guess, but the truth of it is, Bobby Stoops is not a whole lot younger than Kirk Ferentz.
Right.
I don't know how Bob feels about coaching again. He certainly loves Iowa. I don't know that that'll be in Bobby's future because maybe Kirk's going to go for a while yet. I suspect he will.
And Mark Rogers himself, Willie Gault, Chicago Bears Super Bowl champ. So he nailed it there as well. Anything else as far as Indiana, Don, that you want to bring up as far as keys to this game on Saturday? I know we've kind of been all over the place. And if anybody does want to call in here in the last few minutes of our show, you're welcome to 860-499-3332. But is there anything else that, in particular, that stands out as far as a key for Iowa to have success week one?
Well, I would say the single biggest key would be turnover margin. It's not going to be easy to win on turnovers against Indiana because they've shown that they're also good and fundamentally sound in the area of turnovers. If we could just be +1 even, I think that would make a difference. As I mentioned last year, there were 18 games out of 50 that were 7-point differential or less. And obviously, you would expect this is going to be a close game. May come down to the last possession of the game. If we can be +1 or better yet +2, even +1 this year. I don't have my notes in front of me, but even +1 was it was around 90% maybe. +1 was like 90% win. And overall, it was 88% win, 35-5. That's pretty amazing for one parameter to be that reliable in predicting a winner. So if I could do two things, I'd win on turnovers and I would have more rushing yards than the opponent. Because I do know that combination last year was 100% win. Win on turnovers, outrush your opponent, you won 100% of the time. Your record, I believe, was 28-0.
And to sort of simplify this, Don, I think most would agree, despite some of the struggles in recent years from Iowa as it relates to running the football effectively, last year was a huge step forward, at least in my opinion. And some people wanted to kind of discredit 2020 as being a COVID year and it didn't count, blah, 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 blah. I think there were some major strides from the interior of the line. I think Cody Ince really emerged last year. Kyler Schott, you mentioned he's out right now. Hopefully he can get back soon, at least for the resumption of conference season. I believe that'd be week 5. But that interior of the line has really improved. And one thing that I've questioned on in the past was, remember in 2019, pass protection really broke down because there were some holes in the center of that line. And of course, Tyler Linderbaum anchors that now. His health is of prime importance. But without Kyler Schott, maybe Justin Britt slides in there. Are you comfortable with the depth they have? I know you alluded to it earlier, but are you comfortable with the depth they have there at offensive line? Because obviously that's going to play a huge role in getting Tyler Goodson and Ivory Kelly Martin going.
I flash back on something that Kirk said years ago as an offensive line coach. And of course, we had a number one ranked team back in '85. I think even in 1985, I do know this in general, Kirk's goal was to have, it's unrealistic that you can have 10 players in the O line that can play winning football. And when I say that, go out and play winning football against just about anybody on our schedule. That's hard to do. If you're lucky, you have maybe 8 guys that can do that. You have a 2 deep, of course, but there are a couple of guys that you really, whether you want to admit it or not, you really hope they don't find themselves playing against the best teams on our schedule. If you're lucky, you have 8, and if you do have 8, you'd like to think that you have a backup center that could play winning football, and you have a third guard that could play winning football, and then one of those 3 guards has to be able to play both left and right to effectively give you a 2 deep there. And then, of course, the same thing at tackle. You hope to have a third tackle that can play winning football, and now one of those 3 tackles has to be able to play both left and right. That's about as efficient as you can be, is to have 8 guys you can win with. You'll have a true 2 deep, but the reality might be, of course, if one of those starters goes down, you're not necessarily going to play that guy that's listed second team behind him. It depends, of course, on whether or not there's a better solution involving one of those other backups.
And I'll kind of tease my season predictions, Don, here as we head out. And I'll just say it. I know this is going to sound like a homer. I do think Iowa's going to win the West this year. I question my biggest question all around, I think, is just depth. It seems like Iowa does, with the exception being, I think, wide receiver. It seems like they've developed a good amount of depth. And defensive back, I think they've got plenty of depth. But I question depth at tight end. I question depth at running back. I question depth, certainly, obviously, at quarterback. And probably both sides of the line at linebacker as well. I think Iowa is very dependent, as they are every year, and I think every college football team would claim this, but I think they're going to be very dependent on health, just everywhere. Sam Laporta goes down. Now Luke Lachey or Josiah Miamin, who we've never really seen in game action. They're your number one tight ends. Jack Campbell, Seth Benson, those 2 guys, we saw what happened early last year against Purdue and Northwestern when those linebackers went down. And I think you could argue if they played, this might have been an 8-0 football team last year. So I do think, again, pending health, Iowa has an excellent chance at winning the West this year. Your thoughts on that? I know you're probably not real big into season predictions, Don, but your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think the teams that typically are playing for the championship, now maybe Ohio State's in a different category because I think their depth is better than anyone else, any single team in the Big Ten. Their backups in some cases are better than other teams within the conference. But I do think the teams in general that are playing for that, put it this way, the teams that win the West, probably year in and year out, would be a little luckier than the average team in terms of injuries. It's unrealistic that you're going to get to play with the same lineup all season because injuries are part of the game. We all know that. But that's why it's so critical for those backups to be ready. Now, maybe they're not ready in game 1, but maybe they're not needed in game 1. Maybe you're able to actually bring them along, and maybe they're not needed for another month. Maybe it's mid-season when you actually need that guy to step in and play. I'll give you a prime example. Way back in time, I had the privilege of coaching a great receiver by the name of Danon Hughes. And maybe you're old enough to remember Dane, and he ended up playing, I believe, 7 or 8 years for the Chargers. I'm sorry, for the Chiefs.
Chiefs, yeah.
Kansas City Chiefs. He's doing radio for the Chiefs now. And anyway, we were playing Wisconsin here in Kinnick. And on that day, Danon became the all-time leading receiver in terms of receptions on that very day. It was against the Barry Alvarez coach team. The rest of the story is that Danon got injured in the third quarter of that game, and the backup went in. Wasn't anybody in Kinnick Stadium that knew who the backup was. The only people that knew were the players and coaches. His name was Anthony Dean, and a lot of people still don't know that much about Anthony Dean, but he was a hero that day because late in the game, we came from behind to beat him, and Anthony Dean caught 2 or 3 passes on the last drive, and it was a game-winning drive at the end of the game. Down the goal line on 4th and goal at the 3, he caught the touchdown pass to put us down by 1, and then he caught the 2-point play to win the game. and he was a backup going into the game that had really hardly been on the field at all. That's a great example of a guy being ready to play. The backup quarterback for Illinois today was ready to play, and he went out and proved it. Anthony Dean proved the same thing. So the good news is maybe the guy that's not quite ready for next weekend, maybe he doesn't have to play when the game's on the line. Maybe we're lucky enough to win by a couple of touchdowns, and maybe he gets to play the last series of the game and get his feet wet. And maybe he's not really needed for another three weeks. And in the meantime, of course, those coaches are getting him better and better prepared to get in there and play. And my hope is that he's not required to play before he's ready to play. And but there's no doubt you got to be a little lucky on injuries, and we'll keep our fingers crossed. And of course, the best way to be lucky on injuries is to have superior conditioning, to be in great shape. You know, fatigue makes cowards of us all, and if you're tired and you're going less than full speed, you're a little more susceptible to injury. So let's hope that we don't have any of those issues, not just this next weekend, but going forward too.
And to kind of cap this all off, Don, my biggest concern would have to be probably quarterback. Obviously, Spencer improved as we went through the year last year, and the position that I'm most comfortable with right now is defensive back, and it's because of this simple fact. We know Phil Parker, and I'm sure you have insight as to why Phil has this philosophy, but he doesn't like to. We saw it with Desmond King, we saw it with Josh Jackson. He doesn't like to throw defensive backs. If he's got a defensive back that takes one side of the field, he usually likes to keep him to that side of the field. He doesn't usually like to switch him around. And I think Iowa has had at times has had problems defending big plays. Not often, of course. Phil Parker's excellent at doing so, but I think this year with having two defensive backs who I view as almost equals, Matt Hankins and Riley Moss, and I think some depth with Jamari Harris and Terry Roberts, that is no longer an issue, at least, again, pending health. We know cornerbacks tend to get sort of beat up at Iowa, especially early on in the season, it seems like. But that would probably be my position of strength at this point. Do you have any thoughts? Your position of strength, maybe your position of concern?
I agree with you. I think as a whole, those four defensive backs positions, or let's talk about five even, talk about the cash position, because we're going to end up playing the equivalent of a lot of nickel defense against a lot of these spread offenses. It'll be only six guys in the box, if you will, and our cash defender, our what we used to call our nickel defender, he's going to be on the field a lot, and all five of those guys have a lot of game experience already, with just a little bit of luck. And like you say, I used to say this: I don't care if he is an all-conference corner. We only have one football, so why don't we put our best guy against their weakest corner? Let's do that. Let's make a point of doing that. There was a team that did that to us a couple of years ago by the name of Purdue. I don't know if you remember the game. It was in Kinnick.
Oh, yeah.
To start the second half, and I give Jeff Brom a lot of credit. He came out in the second half, and if I'm not mistaken, he threw the ball to their best receiver, who lined up into the boundary. They threw to him something like 5 out of 6 snaps. I'm talking about 5 or 6 plays in a row, and that maybe there was one snap in there that was a run. The result
Different
of that
cornerbacks too, right? Different cornerbacks.
You might be right. The result of it was 2 touchdowns. I do remember that. I also remember that after the first touchdown, Phil put in the backup corner, and Purdue took advantage of him also. But Phil's next solution was to take that all-conference corner that had been playing on the wide field, and from that point forward, that cornerback went with that star receiver, and that pretty much ended the mismatch. But in the meantime, of course, they'd scored 2 touchdowns and they won the game.
Anthony
So that's
Mahungo.
Smart football. It's not enough to have one good corner, because the other guy is just going to get one out with the football. They're going to throw his way.
Yeah, Anthony Mahungu. That was the wide receiver that continued to burn Iowa in that game, and I do remember that. So Phil has shown he's willing to make adjustments, but I really do think those with Riley and Matt Hankins, they can stay healthy. It's going to anchor a very strong secondary, and then of course Jack Kerner. You mentioned Dane Belton at cash, Kayvon Merriweather. And then hopefully some depth will emerge there as well. Don, it has been a privilege. We look forward to talking with you all season long, following each and every game. For anybody who is, again, new to this channel, subscribe here. Iowa at the voice of college football, Iowa at the voice of CFB. We are going to be coming to you after every Iowa game and giving you the breakdown. Hopefully, a lot of Iowa wins, Don.
That sounds good. One other comment about those DBs, and I had a chance to congratulate those guys recently. They're a little unusual in this regard. They all actually have good hands. If we get our hands on it, we typically hang on to it. That's one reason we've been one of the best teams in college football in terms of interceptions. Now, the area that we can improve, we can do a better job as a defensive unit at forcing fumbles. I would say we're only more average in terms of forcing fumbles. We're definitely above average in making interceptions. If we have a chance to get our hands on the ball, we're probably going to hang on to it. That's how well those guys catch.
And fully expect Phil Parker to have these guys ready for week 1 as he does each and every year. So we appreciate the time, Don, and we'll talk to you next Saturday. We may have lost Don. Don left us a little early. Can you hear me, Don? Oh, that was maybe my cue that we ran overtime. Here's Don. Are you with us, Don?
Yes.
Okay. I thought maybe you decided to go to sleep early.
No.
So it was
I'm
a pleasure.
person.
You're a night owl. It was a pleasure talking to you, Don, and we will talk to you next Saturday.
That sounds good, Corey. I look forward to it.
All right, Corey Brada from the Hawkeye of the Storm for Don Patterson here at Iowa at the voice of CFB. We'll talk to you soon.